Hello, and welcome back to week 4 of our Applied Food Science course. This week, of course, we're talking about dairy, one of the most amazing and essential food groups that's out there. It's actually a really fascinating and unique category of food group in that dairy, milk specifically, is designed to be a complete food. That is to say that it contains all of the carbohydrates and proteins and sugars and fat that we need to survive as infants. Now, as we grow bigger, obviously we need more food. So most mammal species, and we should say that this is not a unique thing to humans. All mammals, by definition, drink milk as infants. But as we get bigger, we need more and more food. That's why most of our diet subsists of meat and fruit and vegetables and grains. But because our mothers can't produce enough milk to sustain an adult or even a toddler or a teenager, nonetheless. But milk remains a staple food because it's very uniquely composed of a whole bunch of different things in relatively even proportions, which is very unique to dairy. Now, what is milk made of? Well, it's primarily made of 3 different things. Apart from the water that makes up most of it, there is the fat. Now, the fat that is in milk is just like every other fat, that is to say a triglyceride. So we have our glycerol backbone and we have our 3 fatty acid tails. Now, the fat that is in milk is especially interesting because while it is a liquid, in a liquid, most of the fat is actually saturated fat. Now you may be thinking to yourself, saturated fat? Isn't that supposed to be solid? Well, guess what? In milk, it technically is. Because the fat in milk resides in these things called fat globules. They're kind of like this balloon here. In that inside, there's a whole bunch of solid fat, saturated fats stacked together, zippered up. Now, it's within this membrane. And what's nice about this membrane is while fat doesn't like water, the outside of this membrane is okay being around the water around it. And what's really good for us is twofold. One, being milk and being the substance that infants eat, we need a less solid way to transport fat into the diet of an infant. Now, it would be pretty gross if you had to drink just straight vegetable oil to get your fat. So these little globules that contain fat in a membrane that is okay being around water allows there to be fat and water in the same substance. And that's absolutely wonderful for our nutrition. The other nice thing for us is that we actually have a word we assign to the texture of solid fat suspended within liquid or a semi-solid phase, and that is creaminess. So if you've ever drank milk and thought, this is nice and creamy, or cream or butter, that is because there's solid fat suspended in liquid or a semi-solid foodstuff. Awesome. So what else is milk made of? Well, we've got our carbohydrate. Now, our carbohydrate in milk is a very unique carbohydrate. Not in its structure, mind you. It is still a 6-carbon ring, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, except it's actually 2 of these bonded together. And when 2 of these bond together in the unique way that they do in milk, it is called lactose. You hear lactose, the first thing you probably think of is, oh, my friend Jerry, he's lactose intolerant. He gets gassy after he eats his cheese. Why? Well, as it turns out, as we said before, milk is an infant food. So most mammals, after infancy, lose their ability to digest all of the stuff in milk, primarily lactose. We don't really find lactose anywhere in the world other than in milk. So we lose our ability to digest lactose. Now you might be thinking, but I can eat lactose and I have no problem with it. You are a mutant. That's right. You heard me right. Anthropologists think about thousands of years ago, people in Northern Europe actually evolved and mutated to have the ability to digest lactose even as an adult, because it was such a huge, rich, hearty substance that people were drinking when they would drink cow's milk or goat's milk. The body naturally selected for and mutated for people that could digest lactose longer than just in infancy, giving those people a evolutionary advantage. They didn't fart when they ate lactose. And so if you can digest lactose, good job. You are actually a minority population in the grand scheme of the planet Earth. So what else is in milk, you're asking? Well, the final ingredient is protein. Now, milk, we split their proteins into two separate categories. Now, it's got a lot more than just two proteins, but we put them into two general categories. And you've probably heard of them, thanks to our friend Little Miss Muffet. That is to say, our two proteins are the curds and the whey. So you're probably looking at this and you're going, those two look totally different, because they are. Curd proteins, or casein, as they're known in the scientific community, are long, stringy proteins with lots of arms extending out everywhere. And whereas whey proteins traditionally tend to be a lot smoother, less rough edges, less things protruding out. But the big defining feature between these two is actually how they act when they are in an acidic environment. Which is important for milk, because bacteria that live in milk have to live on some carbohydrate, and the only carbohydrate there is lactose. So if there is bacteria in this milk, then they will take that lactose and turn it into lactic acid. Now, lactic acid obviously acidifies the milk and causes the proteins to react differently. Whey proteins, acidity has no effect. They just stay dissolved in the water of the milk. They're just floating around doing their business. Whereas casein, or curd proteins, as soon as the acidity starts to drop a little bit, these things will actually start globbing together. And they start binding with each other. And they form these big old clumps that we call curds. Makes sense, right? Okay. So we've got milk. It's a wonderful thing. But there's a few problems with it. You see, when milk started getting really popular, primarily in Europe, everybody was clamoring for it. But only really farmers and maybe some of the royal elite could get really good, consistent milk. The problem is that milk, after it's harvested, it doesn't stay good for that long. And even if it does, the transportation of milk was often done in big open pails throughout the countryside, and just tons of bacteria and other nonsense would get in this milk, causing rampant disease and lots of icky stuff. So, how come we have so much milk everywhere? Well, it's really primarily thanks to two big technological advances. The first is thanks to our good old friend Louis Pasteur. Now, Louis Pasteur was a French scientist in the 1800s, and he thought to himself, how could I get some of that delicious dairy to me every single day without worrying about being sick? And so he had an idea. He thought, bacteria die when they are exposed to very high heat, but milk does not change that much around high heat. So here's what he did. He found that if you heated up milk to below the boiling point of water, so somewhere around 150 degrees Fahrenheit, water boils at 200 degrees Fahrenheit, he could effectively kill all of the bacteria that were living in that milk while preserving the fats and the protein and the sugar that are in that milk that make it so wonderful and delicious. And that process we refer to as pasteurization, for pasture. This was a huge coming of age for milk because it allowed this milk to be transported all over the countryside, even all over the world, because it greatly increased the shelf life, eliminating that base level of bacteria. Now, the other problem that people had, though, is that now that milk could last a little longer, what would happen is as it sat out for a while, it tended to separate, which makes sense. Fat and water, which are two of the big components of milk, naturally will separate from each other given time. If you've ever had a vinaigrette or go in the grocery store and look at the salad dressing aisle, you'll see that most of the salad dressings have a very distinct oil and water phase on top of each other. And that's cool. That nature likes to do that. But we don't like it as much in our milk. Oh, it's not great when you have to shake up your milk in order to get before you drink it. Ooh, not so good. So, again, mid-1800s, somebody had the idea. They said, the problem is that the fat is in these big old globules. And these globules, they really, because they're so big, the fat is so packed in there, the density difference between a fat globule and water is so great, these things will rise to the surface. So their idea was, what if we take the fat and we make the fat really, really, really tiny? So that's what they did. The process of homogenization, which is what this is called, basically takes the milk and it shoots it through this really fine holes. And what that does is it breaks up these globules into really, really tiny pieces of fat. And while it does tend to rupture these globules, the fat crystals that go through are so tiny that we don't detect any graininess in our mouth, and it generally tends to prevent the separation of fat and water phase of our milk. Awesome job. So, if that's not good enough for you, let's say you wanted to take milk and bring it over from England to the Americas. Oh, that's a whole new problem. You see, milk is such a great food to go with on journeys because it has all of the essential vitamins, fat, sugar, proteins that you need. And it's all conveniently packed right there. But it spoils really quickly. So there were a couple ideas on this. The main idea was, bacteria primarily live in the water. So if we can get rid of the water, this will last longer. And so that's what people did. That's why we have evaporated milk, condensed milk, sweetened condensed milk, and dry milk. All of those are essentially variations on evaporating water in order to condense this down to just the fat and proteins. Sweetened condensed milk adds sugar, and if you add enough sugar, in fact, sweetened condensed milk is about 55% sugar. Whoa! Talk about a sugar rush. But if you add this in there, it makes it last longer. Okay, so now you've got these incredibly shelf-stable, complete foods that people could travel with, bake with, cook with, even consume if you felt so inclined. I can't really recommend it for the taste. And this went all the way to the extreme. In fact, dry milk or powdered milk is essentially 95% of the water has been evaporated out of this milk. So all you're left with are the milk solids, is what they're called. That is to say, the fat, amino acids, and sugar kind of clump together once there's no water to dissolve them in. Okay, so we can make milk last way longer, essentially process it to a point that it might not even be considered milk anymore. Well, then we've got the other side of things, the culinary side of things. When we want to not make milk last so much longer as taste better and be more versatile in the kitchen. Well, we can do that in a actually fairly similar way to the process of condensing milk, except rather than just straight evaporate out the water, we're going to do this a little different, a little more gently. You see, as you start separating the fat from the water portion of milk, and farmers would do this if you just got a bunch of milk and you let it sit out all day, what would happen is you'd get this top part that had a much higher fat content than the bottom part. And if you skimmed that off and you took that was called cream. Now, the bottom part, fun fact, is how you get things like skim milk or lower percent milks, because essentially all the fat has gone up to the top. But cream, by the definition of the US or the FDA, is at least 20% fat by volume, but cannot exceed 65% fat by volume. 20% fat is what we would consider like a light cream. And we could go down. Milk is traditionally around 4% fat, whereas half and half is reasonably somewhere in between. But normally your whipping creams are somewhere around 40%, and then we get up to things like plastic cream, which is 65% fat by volume. It's almost butter at that point, honestly. But cream has a few advantages that we don't have when it comes to regular milk as you increase that fat content. Now, the first one is that when you heat up milk, what tends to happen is the casein proteins, while they don't respond well to acid, they also don't respond well to heat. So you get all these casein proteins bonding together, again, at high temperatures, and you get these clumps forming. When you scald milk, you can get this separation. Not so great. Now, with cream, however, fun fact, these casein molecules aren't just prone to bound to each other. They can also bind to our fat globules. Now, if we have enough fat globules in our milk, we can actually capture all of the casein proteins before they have a chance to clump together with each other. In this way, a high fat content in milk can actually stabilize our cream, meaning that at higher temperatures it's not going to curdle, which is definitely good, especially when we're making things like sauces or custards, and we don't want our food to curdle, right? Now, the other benefit to having such a high fat content is when you start whipping it. Now, if you whip cream, and I bet you can see where we're going with this, essentially what you're going to do by agitating those fat globules is you're going to poke a whole bunch of holes in them. So you can see all these little snowflakes is what we're going to represent, use to represent our little holes in there. Essentially, these are holes where fat is just poking out just a little bit. So the membrane hasn't been totally ruptured, but the fat's poking out a little bit. Now, fat, we know, does not like water. It's like, nah, get out of here. But there are two things fat can do. First, it can grab onto the fat coming out of other fat globules. So in this way, these things can grab onto each other, and they can maybe grab another one of these and form this nice little, solid structure, right? And this is what gives whipped cream its structure, whereas milk foams, like you'd find on the top of a cappuccino, often go away very, very quickly. Now, this structure isn't the only good thing about cream. You see, I said these little fat holes can grab onto something else, that being air. So when you get these little agitated holes and the fat coming out, they grab onto each other and make little cages and a little structure, but also they're going to trap air inside of that little cage. Awesome. And what that does is it gives us this nice, light, airy foam to it. Wonderful. Whipped cream is the best. All right. Okay, so what happens if you do keep whipping this? This is actually what you're going to find out in your lab. If you keep whipping this and you get to the point where you pop our little bubbles, we get a release of all the fat that was inside those globules. And what's great about this is this fat has some wonderful properties in that it is incredibly creamy, right? This is creamy butter fat. And also, we've got a lot of it. Okay, and so what this means is if you keep whipping cream past the point of whipped cream, most people call this churning. Again, I bet you can see where we're going with this. Essentially what we're doing is we're rupturing all those fat globules and we're getting the raw fat, the triglycerides, out of there. Okay, and now when we do this, what's going to happen is it's going to increase the rate of separation. So if you take cream and you churn it up and then you let it sit for, say, 12 to 24 hours, you would get this top layer that's incredibly fat rich, usually about 80% fat, and this bottom layer of buttermilk, which, right, is basically the milk from butter. Okay. Now, if you take off that top part, guess what? You've got butter. So let's talk butter. Butter is, again, by the FDA's definition, at least 80% fat, but not to exceed 16% water. So usually that's what butters are, right? You want to put the least amount of